Okay, so continuing here, kind of this discussion beginning with the Iowa caucus. Um, it's always been an interesting one, and it's a fairly controversial one because, in the grand scheme of things in our country, um, Iowa's a pretty unimportant state. I know it was one of our 14 battlegrounds this year, um, but it's a smallish state. It's certainly not as important to Democrats as Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Ohio or any of the others. But for a long time now, Iowa has kicked off the primary season. It is the first place a candidate can actually win delegates. And so the Iowa caucus comes first. And for this, we need to talk about what exactly a caucus is. And so when we talk about caucuses, um, we're talking about an event that's most often in rural states like Maine or Iowa or places that are, not an urbanized society like California. But it is an event where voters who are registered members of the party gather at a caucus site to express their presidential preference and basically elect and choose delegates. And so the problem with the caucus, and this goes back to the cartoon you saw last week when we were analyzing the point of those political cartoons, is the caucus was a bunch of old white people at a wrestling match. Remember? And that is one of the main criticisms of a caucus is that because it's a meeting and you can't just go in and go into a voting booth, vote, and then go home, it tends to require more time. When you go to caucus, it can be 2 hours, 3 hours. And so because it requires so much time, you effectively lower turnout rates. You lower how many people participate in it. Maybe I don't want to get a babysitter. Maybe I don't, want to hang out with strangers all night long. Maybe I only have like a half hour break from work. And so the fact that a caucus is used in Iowa to select delegates from that state is an often criticized thing. But at the same time, the parties would argue that even though Iowa is pretty insignificant and a caucus, is not super representative of the party, it does provide a really good test of how um, serious a staff you've put together if you're a candidate, right? Because in order to win the Iowa caucus, you really have to organize, get your message out, connect with voters, and basically run a very well-oiled and organized machine. And if you can't do that, um, not only will you not win the caucus and get delegates out of the caucus, but you probably aren't going to be a good bet for the eventual, um, you know, presidential race. If you can't organize enough to win one small state, then good luck to you. And so, excuse me, sorry. Because it is first, Iowa's first, um, a lot of candidates spend a lot of time in Iowa. Even though it's a relatively unimportant state, it gets probably the most important or most attention out of any state in the entire presidential primary. Because if you can win Iowa, you get a huge boost to your brand. You get a ton of media coverage. You get some momentum. Your fundraising totals will go up. And so winning the Iowa caucus can have a hugely positive impact, the same way that if you do terrible in the Iowa caucus and you come in like seventh place, and secure no delegates, this might be the time where you'd be like, okay, this isn't gonna work, right? We got blown out of the water in Iowa. We're gonna start losing our political donations here pretty soon because people don't want to donate to a loser. Um, and bad losses, fundamentally, in Iowa can spell the end of a campaign. And so this is essentially the vision. It's quaint and like I said, it's common in rural states, but essentially it's a bunch of people who gather in a room, a high school gymnasium or an auditorium or something. And the first kind of step to a caucus is, the county chair will open the meeting and basically say, start to gather with your similar preferences. So if you arrive to the caucus and say, I really am going to support Bernie Sanders here, then you'll join the Bernie Sanders vote or voters initially. And then you'll look and you'll say, okay, in this map, candidate E and candidate F are not really viable. They're not going to earn any delegates. It's not going to work. So, candidate E and F, do you want to join somebody else? Otherwise, you're not going away. Um, and then, basically they look at each other and they each make their appeal and they make an argument to, so a representative from candidate A will stand up and make a good case as to why, excuse me, why their candidate's the best, hoping to gather, some people changing their minds. But at the end of the night, after, groups have been set and cases have been made and everyone's like, okay, I'm good where we're at, where nobody's moving, um, basically, whatever your percentage of the total number of delegates here is what your part candidate will earn, right? And so take a look at the bottom. Right, we can see in this auditorium, there's a total number of 100 participants. In group A, there's 28. And so there's two delegates available out of this precinct. And so 28 times 2 is 0.56. We round up, and that means that group candidate A will get one delegate. So let's move out of Iowa and its weird caucus process into kind of a more traditional primary. And the second primary is another state that, in the Electoral College, New Hampshire only has 4 Electoral College votes. Nobody really cares about it all that much. So the fact that it comes second has a lot of people scratching their heads. Even still, it's kind of a tradition. New Hampshire goes second. Sometimes people ride a ton of momentum out of Iowa and they, get to New Hampshire and they start doing their ground game thing there and they find that, hey, I was actually able to win in Iowa, but my strategy is not translating to New Hampshire and I just came in sixth place. But a primary is fundamentally more simple than a caucus, right? In a caucus, you're there for a couple hours making arguments to each other, gathering, figuring out who's going to be the delegates voting. In a primary is you go in to a voting booth, you cast your ballot, and you go home, right? And so these primaries are much easier. They're much more common in this country. New Hampshire obviously is the very first one, and so if you ride high out of Iowa and then come in and clean house and win in New Hampshire, then you head into the third one, which is South Carolina, with a ton of momentum. At the same time, maybe you don't do that great in Iowa, you don't really like, you're starting to look better in New Hampshire, and then you destroy it in like a good way in South Carolina. This is a very common occurrence in the nominating process in the primary season. And so a lot of states recognize that states who have an early primary or caucus get a lot more attention, right? We saw that in the cartoons of the journalists running from, state to state. And so many states have tried to front load their primary to move it ahead of New Hampshire or Iowa, saying, hey, if Nevada can come first, we'll get all the attention that you normally get. Um, and so, many states have front loaded their primary to try to get more attention. And this process is basically when you try to move your primary earlier in the calendar in order to make sure that people pay attention to you. This was always a problem when I lived in Oregon. Oregon was a pretty solidly Democratic state, um, but it was one of the very last primaries. So by the time Oregon's primary went, in most years, America already knew who the nominee was going to be because they'd earned enough delegates before even getting um, to Oregon. And so, Oregon would come around and nobody paid any attention to it. Nobody shined a light on issues that are important to Oregon. Nobody talked about it in any way whatsoever. And so, Oregon might try and say, okay, we don't want to be at the back of the line where we get no attention. How about we move our primary up and, we're going to be top 5 or top 10? Gosh, stayed up late last night for the election coverage, and now I'm tired. Um, and what they're trying to do is make sure that their primary in their state gets actually people's attention, and that it's not just ignored. Um, and so, for example, Romney in Texas, in California in 2012, um, both of those states were pretty late, in the game. And so by the time California got around, Romney had already basically wrapped up the nominee, and nobody even needed to bother going to the nomination campaign in California. And so that's a problem for the party. The party wants to keep voters as engaged as possible for as long as possible. But the problem of front loading, of everybody moving their primary forward, is that by condensing the primary process, you basically don't get all the information on a candidate, right? And so if somebody's running for 6 months, that's a whole lot more time to be asked questions, to, for have their past looked into, and all of that. Um, and so basically the parties recognize that this is not good, and they've largely tried to shut down front loading and saying, sure, Vermont, you can move your primary ahead of Iowa, but if you do, don't expect to have any candidates whatsoever for the next 10 years at our conventions. You'll be dead to us. And then Vermont says, all right, I guess we'll just not do it. And so let's take a look here. So now let's say candidates have won um, a primary or caucus. Maybe they won, Iowa, and then they went into New Hampshire and then won. So what now, right? And so at this point, obviously, the candidates for the nomination are just basically trying to earn as many delegates as possible. And so by winning caucuses and by winning primaries, you pick up delegates to then take to the convention, who will vote for you. And if you can get enough votes from delegates, then you're the nominee of the president or for president. And so, basically winning caucuses and primaries, you get delegates. Um, Democrats choose to award proportional delegates, meaning if in the Colorado primary, 64% people went for John Hickenlooper and 25% went for somebody else, then essentially John Hickenlooper would get 64% of the available delegates and the other person would get 25, right? And so Democrats use proportional awarding of delegates at the end of a primary or a caucus, whereas Republicans have a range. In Democrats, it's all proportional. Republicans have some states that are winner take all, some states who are based around congressional districts, like we saw in Nebraska, right, with 5 electoral college votes. The second Nebraskan district went for Biden. Um, and so this happens pretty regularly. So, let's say you won a couple primaries, you're feeling pretty good about yourself. Essentially, this gives you momentum. And what momentum in politics means is more money, right? If you have the spotlight, if people are paying attention to you, if you seem like a serious candidate, in rolls the donations. Winning gives candidates momentum, right? This allows you to raise more money. And it also, the flip side of this is if you lose a primary or caucus badly, you're probably going to watch your fundraising stream dry up. And most often, the person drops out of the race, right? Because if you get hammered in South Carolina or uh, North Carolina, in New Hampshire or Iowa, then you're pretty much dead in the water because you can't arrange and raise enough money to even vote. And so, with 1 minute and 20 seconds, let's take a look at what are the problems with the current primary and caucus season. And the first thing is kind of what we saw in the cartoon, that if you're not one of the early caucuses or primaries, your state is oftentimes feeling like you're just being ignored um, by everyone else, right? And so if I'm Iowa, I get a ton of attention. If I'm New Hampshire, I get a ton of attention. But if I am Indiana, Indiana's pretty late. I don't think I need to pay attention to them. And so this is a criticism that basically too much attention goes to the early caucuses and primaries. Um, and as a result of this, candidates are forced to kind of pander to things that maybe they don't even believe. And so in the West Wing, we saw a famous episode where they basically said, we know in Iowa, in order to win in Iowa, you have to say nice things about ethanol, but we refuse to. We think it's a crap technology that costs a lot of money for taxpayers. We don't support it. And so that's the kind of issue that thrives in these early primaries or caucuses. This idea that a candidate can specifically focus on important issues for that state.